This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I want to read a little bit of an excerpt. I'm not going to name my guest today just yet. That's coming in a second. But consider this. My guest today, along with his co-author, have written an impressive and important book documenting via their own research and that of many scholars the very substantial increase in concentration on the supply side of U.S. industry, leading to a decline in competition and a substantial shift in market and political power away from consumers and labor and toward the owners of capital. That's a big statement. The title of the book, The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies, and the Death of Competition. Nothing like a little provocation for the day. Just a little provocation. The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies, and the Death of Competition. My guest today is Jonathan Tepper. This is his work. What a great read. A hell of a lot of research. A hell of a lot of detail. And it's essential food for thought for all of us. Because let's face it, if just a few guys and gals own everything, and it's 100% monopoly power and ultimately monopoly pricing, we're all screwed. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. So let's get right into the conversation with Jonathan Tepper and dive into something that's bound to make a good many people across this world a little nervous, a little sweaty. The myth of capitalism. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Jonathan Tepper. So Jonathan, I'm thinking to myself, I'm taking my personal being back to the mid-1990s, and I'm thinking, my gosh, I put a website up in 1996. I quickly learned what the idea of search was in 1996. I had to deal with the likes of Alta Vista and InfoSeek and Excite and Lycos and Yahoo even. There wasn't a Google at the time, and it was pretty competitive in the sense that, for a while there, Alta Vista was really good. Then InfoSeek and, Excite sucked and whatever. And then all of a sudden Google came along and Google just made it better. And the adoption to Google seemingly was overnight. And as a fellow entrepreneur, I can only say to myself, man, I wish I came up with that idea to be as successful as the Google guys. Now, those guys were really successful and they took that success and they did some things. They went ahead and they said, God, we got some extra cash. Let's buy YouTube. Well, that was a hell of a move. I mean, that one's paid dividends. And then they also, in the face of massive competition for the handheld cell phone market, the likes of Apple and BlackBerry and all that kind of stuff, the Google guys say, hey, let's come up with an operating system and give it away for free. Apple could have given theirs away for free. They give it away for free and now run it forward, a decade? And then now Google also has 90% market share in the cell phone market for smartphones. And so I look at all this and I say, well, gosh, this looks like success. This looks like guys that have made good decisions. But you have come along and you've thrown a monkey wrench at the party and you've said, hold on, not so fast. We need to think about some issues. Now, did I describe everything fairly right up until this moment?
None of your facts are wrong as you state them. I think there are a few other issues that listeners need to think about and consider when they look at online advertising, the industry and the structure, and when they look at what Google itself does. So the theory behind modern American antitrust is if prices are low, then you really shouldn't care whether you have a monopoly or not, or whether companies merge. And therefore, because the product is free, whether it's search or Android operating system, then, Google's done no wrong. The problem that I have, there are a couple problems. One is, for example, they were allowed to buy DoubleClick. So Google does search ads. and DoubleClick was doing display ads. And so basically there was quite a lot of competition in online advertising, which disappeared when Google was allowed to buy one of its main competitors and was allowed to buy ad exchanges and mobile ad companies. And basically their dominance of online advertising really stems from a complete lack of antitrust enforcement in the online ad space. And then the other issue is obviously that Android appears free, but it's not really free in the sense that consumers are handing over a vast amount of information to Google. People have called it surveillance capitalism, where Facebook and Google can track pretty much everything you do. But there's another issue, a couple other issues that are related to that, which is that Tim Berners-Lee, who essentially created the World Wide Web when he helped establish the standards and protocols, so you could then end up with browsers like Netscape, so people could navigate the internet, which previously was just computers talking to each other. And he thinks that the internet itself is dying. In 2014, over half of all links basically were coming through Facebook or Google, whereas in the past, you would have your blog, and I might have my blog, and we might link to each other, and then we might link to other people. And so you had this very lively ecosystem of blogs and websites linking to each other. And that's what the internet was supposed to be. It was supposed to be open, anarchic, and free. And what's really happened now is what you've seen is essentially two companies now control close to 70% essentially of the links in the internet in terms of directing people, whether it's Facebook or Google. And we can think that they have impartial algorithms, but actually they're not impartial at all in the sense that people program them, people decide who finds what. And then you have an additional layer on top of that, which is that Google doesn't just do search and help you find it. It's not this impartial arbiter, that directs you to your content, but rather they have, for example, Google reviews, right? They compete with Yelp. They take what they call snippets. So if you create on your website content that they want to take, they could put snippets. So you search for trend following or something, the snippet comes up from your website, and then the people don't even visit your website. They just see it in a Google snippet. They've done this to hundreds and hundreds of sites. The most famous one I discuss in my book is celebritynetworth.com, where it took quite a lot of time and money and effort to figure out what celebrities are worth. This website then had quite a lot of traffic, and they had advertising. And then suddenly Google started taking snippets where you could Google, what is Larry David's net worth from Seinfeld? And then people wouldn't even visit the site, right? Because they just see the snippet on Google itself, and then they don't go there. Google's done this with loads and loads of websites. It's not just that they're doing a good job of finding content, but rather they're effectively killing off and demonetizing large parts of the internet. And it's one of the greatest media arbitrages in history when you look at the fact that content creators spend time creating content, they spend time curating it, preparing it. And then Facebook and Google essentially are the ones that make almost all of the money when it comes to content. And then the internet itself is becoming much more centralized and a lot less free and open. Those are some of the key issues. So you have one, which is the complete lax antitrust, where Facebook was allowed to buy Instagram and WhatsApp. Once they could link WhatsApp with Facebook, you can't get a Facebook account without your phone. And as many of your listeners know, there are tons of sites and apps where you can't even use them without a Facebook login. So Tinder and Bumble are two examples. Unless you have a Facebook account, you can't use them. So Facebook's become very much like a digital passport of sorts. Because of that, essentially, most people now need to use Google or Facebook as essentially a platform or the infrastructure on which they are able to access users. And that's not really the way the internet was set up to be. And that's why Tim Berners-Lee thinks the internet itself is dying, and he wants to change that.
Let me push back on you a little bit. Why has there not been legitimate, this is what generally happens in capitalism. If you've got a market system and you have players out there, there's a lot of smart people in the world. The only smart people in the world are not the Google guys and not Zuckerberg. They're both brilliant, lots of success, not take anything away from them, but they're not the only smart guys in the world. So my question to you, why has there not been legit competition as these guys get so big, as you just mentioned, controlling 70%? Where's the competition? Why are the other smart guys around the world not getting involved? Smart ladies and men. Why are they not getting involved? Why are they not kind of fighting back in the normal capitalistic way we would have expected by now?
Sure. So there's a couple of reasons. If you remember, in the 1990s, there was the Microsoft antitrust trial. What was at issue there was that Microsoft controlled the operating system for over 90% of computers were Windows-based. Because of that, Microsoft could incorporate its Explorer browser. They went from having no market share to suddenly completely dominating the browser. They were effectively tying it at the time. And the government went after them. Microsoft was very chastened, and they then did not abuse their market dominance afterwards to try to pump their own programs. So what's very interesting is that if Microsoft had wanted, they could have essentially made MSN search the default search for the Explorer browser, and Google would have been killed off, and never really would have taken off. They didn't do that, and people could then go pick what their search was. That really was what allowed people to choose Google as their search. When you had that little search window before people were searching within the URL bar. What's fascinating is that Google, of course, complained, in fact, that it would raise antitrust issues if MSN was the default search. Well, fast forward to today, Google pays money to be the default search engine installed essentially in Firefox, and they pay Apple to be the default search to be installed in the iOS search. And then through Chrome, which has 60% market share globally, and then Android, they essentially established themselves as the default search. So you aren't really getting any competition. Most people are too lazy to change that.
Let me stop you for a sec. Lazy. Many of the points that you raise, I've got a ton of pieces of paper in front of me, I agree with, but I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate from the Google perspective. Lazy should not be the reason that antitrust, and the regulators are sicked on me, right? I mean, it's got to be more than lazy.
It's not even laziness, right? When it's the default option, it's the same thing as Microsoft, right? Microsoft essentially could have made MSN the default option. You can't change it. Most people don't. There's extensive evidence for that. But even more troubling, getting back to your original question, which is why are smart entrepreneurs not going out there? There is absolutely no interest by anyone in Silicon Valley or anywhere, in fact, to fund search engines. And the fact that you haven't seen a new search engine in over 10 years tells you that essentially, once they've established themselves in a dominant position like this, unlike what theory would suggest, which is you have a large profit pool and people come and attack you, it doesn't actually happen in practice. If you look at the large tech companies, they've all done about 500 acquisitions over the last 6 years. So basically, any small competitor in any space gets bought out. That's one reason, obviously, why Facebook has been buying competitors. Google buys competitors. It's pretty easy for these very large companies to exert market dominance, and essentially, you can't be found. It's like the old Stalinist days where your face will get blacked out of a photo if you somehow fall out of favor. That's really how the internet works, effectively, where the dominant platforms decide what gets seen and what doesn't get seen.
Let me take this a little bit wider to get us out of the tech space, for example, because I love that you're kind of laying out these scenarios. So I've spent a lot of time in Asia in the last 5 years, and there's one thing that I know about flying between America and Asia, especially if I'm going towards Asia from America, West Coast towards like Tokyo or something. I refuse to fly on US airlines. Only if they're pulling my teeth out, all the Asian carriers are absolutely full, and there's absolutely no other option will I get onto a US carrier. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. Service, just everything about the whole experience is not something you want to write home to mom about. And there's a reason for that too. And look, I feel for people flying inside of America. Every seat is filled. I mean, you're generally on 737s or 757s or something flying cross country for 5 hours. It's like in a sardine can. And there's no improvement in the airline space. And that's because why? We've got 4 airlines and they've got dominant position, and that's just the way it's going to be for the rest of time, huh?
So that's a very interesting example. In the book, while most people are fascinated by digital monopolies lately, and that's the hot topic, the book goes in great detail looking at other industries where you've seen industrial concentrations and merger waves. And what's interesting is that the Obama White House, or the Justice Department FTC under Obama, allowed the mergers of the main airlines. So what's happened in the US is that you had over 9 major airlines. Now basically you still have Southwest, but you've got 4 main airlines, and they were all allowed to merge. And what's interesting isn't just that, it sounds like that might be a very competitive marketplace, but the way that the flights are arranged geographically, almost all of them operate out of what are known as fortress hubs. So if you live anywhere near Charlotte, North Carolina, so that, mid-Atlantic, American Airlines has a complete monopoly there. If you live near Houston, it's United. And so Atlanta is Delta. And because of that, they have a tremendous amount of pricing power because you don't really have a choice going out of these hubs. Also, what's happened is because there are now very few players, it's much more easy for them to collude tacitly, where they can go on a conference call. And there have been quite a few academic papers, and I cite some of them in the book, where the CEOs will talk about what they plan on doing in terms of capacity expansion, in terms of new seats. And so they basically can make sure that they're not expanding capacity or doing very much. Then they now have huge pricing power. They can pack the seats. And what's fascinating, if you look at the pricing, there was deregulation essentially in the early 80s in airlines. It was a great success in many ways. Prices then fell pretty much in a straight line. And it was only really with the merger wave that we saw under Obama that we then saw prices increasing again. One of the theories behind antitrust doctrine, essentially Robert Bork and the Chicago School pushed it, was that if you got mergers, you would get economies of scale, you'd get greater efficiencies, and all these efficiencies would magically be passed on to customers. In theory, there's no reason to be against a monopoly if it gave you lower prices. But all of the studies, and I go through dozens and dozens in the book, show that when you get mergers, you get higher prices. And so the consumer welfare standard, as they call it, is clearly a dud, even on its own terms.
Let me keep you at the word efficiency for a second. I'm thinking that if the typical American, for example, is sitting around right now with their smartphone or their tablet or their laptop and they're buying stuff, they're in heaven. They go to Amazon and they can just buy anything. They seem to like the prices. I mean, malls are more and more empty, and they don't seem to really mind that Jeff Bezos, is making a bloody fortune because they're getting what they want. They're able to get the price, the selection, etc., what they want. Now, I'm assuming that what you would be laying the scenario down is that it might be acceptable for the masses right now, the way Amazon operates, but you would say in the future, things will change and pricing power will be exerted. Is that what you would expect to happen?
A couple issues here. One, we can discuss Amazon specifically, where prices are currently fairly low. I think the bigger problem, which we could discuss later, is that there's sort of industry after industry that Amazon's not in, it's not retail, or you do have exorbitant pricing by monopolies. So for example, we can discuss insurance, medical care, title insurance, not just health insurance, cable bills, like there's just loads and loads of industries where prices are going up and you don't have this amazing choice that you're describing. But if we speak about Amazon specifically, one of the key issues, this was raised by Lina Khan in a paper called The Antitrust Paradox, which I encourage listeners to read if they want. But the paradox here, of course, is that Amazon does have low pricing, and therefore it would seem that antitrust laws don't apply. But one, Amazon essentially is a monopolist when it comes to books, in terms of it's a monopsonist. So a monopolist is the only seller. A monopsonist is the only buyer. And Amazon really is the only buyer for books in the United States. And that's had a clear impact on writers and publishers, and they dictate pricing. But another issue with Amazon is that there's a conflict between their role as essentially a third-party e-commerce provider, where over 45% of their sales are third parties selling on Amazon. And then Amazon, of course, sells its own goods. And this creates a clear conflict of interest where they can favor their own goods in the search results. They can see what's selling and not selling, and then they can immediately cut the seller out and compete with it. So there's a variety of issues that emerge when you look at Amazon that the traditional antitrust doesn't fully address.
You're absolutely right. I did not mean to smooth over. For example, I can think of something like Fios or cable TV in the States, and everyone knows the bills are, if you don't really keep track of your bill on a monthly basis, the next thing you know, someone's charging you $400 a month for your phone or your cable bill. It's insane. And, you're basically, then you have to call them up and, who knows if they'll get it all off. But, look, all of these things that we're talking about, this power that success brings to modern America. And again, I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate here. The most successful investor in America over the last, 50 years? Big Daddy Omaha. He's been saying for eons, I want to have these businesses that don't have competition. And so you have a situation, and you make this case in your book, you have a situation where everyone essentially said, you know what? Maybe Warren has a point. Let's copy him. Let's build that moat, and let's don't have any competition. And I think, but where I'm ultimately going with all these examples is your big ticket, your big picture point. If there's no competition, then we don't have capitalism, do we?
Absolutely. So capitalism has two central elements. One is private property, and the other is competition. And essentially, the reason you need competition is to have clear price signals, to allocate essentially supply and demand to make sure that you get enough. The problem is there are some industries that are natural monopolies, meaning that there's network effects, or there might be something that means that you only want one company doing it. Electricity and water utilities are the classic ones, but there are many other industries where there's no reason why there should be no competition. If you look at the case of Moody's, for example, which Buffett owns, the monopoly there is really a function of legislation. And these are nationally recognized statistical rating organizations. There's a law that was passed in the late 1970s. And the only way that you can get your bonds issued is if you pay Moody's for rating, and the government dictates who gives that rating. And then that impacts insurance and banking. But clearly, Buffett likes monopolies. Investors like monopolies. But the issue is that there are some industries that have natural monopolies. If you think of like your local water utility, that makes sense. There might be a monopoly that has network effects, right? Like Facebook in terms of social network. But there are many other industries where there's no reason why there should be a monopoly. And in the case of Moody's specifically, the reason the monopoly is there is that there was a law passed in the late 1970s which created a special status, which is a nationally recognized statistical rating organization, NRSRO. Moody's dominant position, essentially a duopoly with S&P, comes from the law. Once companies figure out that they can use regulations and legislation to create artificial monopolies and artificial duopolies or oligopolies, that I think is one, it's terrible for consumers. So Moody's and S&P are able to give any ratings they want, no matter how good or bad they are. They're not going to lose any business. And then they can price above inflation. So Buffett talks about the rise essentially of pricing power. And you see that in terms of the rise of prices above inflation. These are not good for markets. They're not good for capitalism. They're not good for consumers. You see these artificial monopolies being erected through lobbying and regulation. And there's a very big section and a chapter in the book on this.
As I think back to 2008, I think back to the crisis. Now I roll forward to today, and I think the numbers that you cite, 5 banks control about half of the nation's banking assets, half of America's banking assets, 5 banks. Now I have to say to myself, okay, let's imagine if there was a repeat of the fall of 2008, something worse, something different. But let's just imagine that there was one of those situations where, unknown to the general public, a bunch of bankers, the CEOs, these 5 guys, show up at the president's office and say, things are about to go south. Now, there's no way the president can really vouch for what's going on internally at those banks. I mean, how can any president or any congressional official or legislative person, how can anyone know? But they just say, hey, you know what? The world is going to end if you don't give us X, Y, Z. And when you got 5 banks controlling half of the assets, that's a hell of a lot of power, isn't it?
Absolutely. If you look back at American history, you can see that JP Morgan had that kind of power. The creation of the Federal Reserve was really a reaction to the panic of 1907, and the Federal Reserve was created in 1912, 1913 in terms of the debates and the legislation. The Clayton Antitrust Act was 1914. So there really was a feeling the American Republic and the banking system should not be held hostage by any one figure like JP Morgan or any small group of financiers. So the motives and aims behind antitrust are not purely in terms of low prices. They're actually about making sure that you don't end up with oligarchs with vast power over the economy. What's interesting, of course, is that the banking system has become more concentrated after the financial crisis. So too big to fail has become even bigger. There are clearly adverse social impact from the size. So that most of the lending to small businesses happens from small banks. The big banks generally don't do lending to small businesses. They tend to lend to even bigger businesses. This has an impact in terms of the shape and size of the economy, whether entrepreneurs and local businesses can receive funding. You know, there's a wide variety of reasons to be against increasing concentration in the banking system.
Let me take you back to an example we were speaking about earlier. I'm looking at a note here in front of me because it says the paradox that what is good, right, and logical for the corporation often is not good for the economy as a whole. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, Google and Facebook, and you cited that 70% market share currently, and that's where it stands. But would anybody really be complaining if it was only 5% or 20%? And again, this is just kind of the devil's advocate pushback. How do we handle that? Like, is there going to be legislation and regulation where there's a number that says, if the market share gets to be XYZ, then we step in? I mean, or is there already legislation that says something like that and we're not following it? I'm just trying to wrap my arms around this.
I don't think there should be any problem with a company having even an outright monopoly if it's purely the result of essentially organic growth where they're doing something much better than other people. In general, unfortunately, that's just not the way almost all industries have worked. The size that we've seen from most companies has come via acquisitions. This is not somehow just that these companies are out competing and outperforming other companies. They're actively buying competitors across industries. And then when you have extensive regulation, that itself creates very large barriers to entry. I think that a useful standard, and I talk about this in the last chapter of the book, or the conclusion. So if I identify the problem correctly, the question then, of course, is, well, what is the solution? And I have a series of proposals and solutions. Lots of research that shows that when industries get below 6 players, you end up with price increases in almost all cases. I think that what lawyers call a per se, or just a sort of black and white rule saying that companies should not be able to merge when they're highly concentrated, when you have fewer than 6 players, is a good rule. Now, if you want to get market share by competing and doing better, go for it. But you shouldn't be allowed to buy your competitor when you're in a highly concentrated industry. That, I think, is sort of the first solution. I do think that we should break up previous mergers that have gotten rid of competition. Standard Oil was broken up, AT&T was broken up. And what's interesting is, you were talking about productivity and innovation and monopolists. There are a lot of studies showing that as industrial concentration rises, so as you have fewer and fewer competitors, you end up with less innovation and productivity, because really what they want to do is just protect the castle they've got. They don't want to build more or create new products. And the irony is that most innovation tends to come from smaller startups. A lot of big companies can spend money on R&D. AT&T had Bell Labs and IBM had Yorktown. Xerox had the Palo Alto Research Center Park. But as I go through in the book and show, almost all of the benefits from this R&D ended up being delivered by other companies, not by the big companies themselves.
So as we talk about all these issues, I've seen you say this, so I'm asking the question, but I think I already know the answer. You view all of the situations that I'm describing, the particular companies, how they act, you view this as a form of fake capitalism.
Yes. So Joseph Stiglitz used the term ersatz capitalism. I think fake capitalism is probably more accessible as a term for the average person. I think that's definitely correct. I think capitalism involves competition. And to the extent that you don't see it, then what we're looking at really is fake capitalism. And I'm a huge proponent of capitalism. So my critique is, G.K. Chesterton said the problem with capitalism is not that there are too many capitalists, but that there are too few. And I completely agree.
And the average person might be thinking, okay, these guys are having this philosophical conversation, but life marches on. I'll buy something on Amazon tomorrow. I'll use my iPhone. I've got all these devices. I've got all this convenience. Prices are not too high so far. But you make the cogent case that, hey, look, ultimately, if there is no economic freedom, the next thing that goes is your political freedom.
I wouldn't be the first person to make this argument. What's quite interesting is that Milton Friedman made it. So if you're on the right, people look to Friedman. Brandeis made it on the left. Hayek also made it. And I have a quote in the book from Hayek himself, who said that if he had to pick between greater freedom and a loss of efficiency, he would go with freedom any time. I think that when you look at the United States, the U.S. exported antitrust to the rest of the world after World War II. There's a very good book on that, The Antitrust in the Making of the Modern World. But basically, one of the reasons why Hitler was able to rise was that the German industries had taken their cue from the U.S. They liked the trust structure, and the German industries created cartels. They banded together. IG Farben basically modeled itself on Standard Oil. When the U.S. then went into Germany after World War II, one of the central aims, and it's in the Potsdam Agreement, was to not only denazify Germany, but also to decartelize Germany and break up these industrial trusts. The idea is that economic freedom is essentially a prerequisite to political freedom. And if you hand over all the power to a few people, then those people will often make decisions that's not in the interest of everyone.
Are we at a situation, though, right now where typical USA government is out of its league, can't handle this situation, either doesn't know how to handle it, doesn't want to handle it, not capable of handling it? I mean, it just looks like to me that the size and scope of what you've laid out. I mean, look, you've probably been on Capitol Hill before. Most of our leaders in America, Congress, et cetera, all the way up, these are not often rocket scientists. These are usually people that just have learned one thing in their life, and that's how to shake hands and get elected. Are we asking them to do too much?
A slightly more nuanced answer or view of the problem that one could have, because when you first approach it, you think, well, you know what, maybe we need more laws, or maybe we need more enlightened regulators or legislators. And I think that the fundamental problem really is that it's regulatory capture, which is to say that we could pass laws tomorrow, and to the extent that lobbying exists, those laws are going to be written to favor larger companies, and to the extent that you set up independent bodies like the FCC or the FTC to regulate industries, these bodies themselves will be captured by the large companies. This is the idea of the revolving door, where someone works at the FCC and they immediately then goes to work for Comcast and then back. And at the FTC, which is supposed to enforce antitrust with the Department of Justice, you basically there's some people who've been in and out of sort of private practice representing companies that want to merge to the FTC, which then has to oversee whether the mergers get done for 40 years.
They're all in bed together.
Exactly. And Upton Sinclair said that, it's very difficult to convince a man of something when his salary depends on not understanding it. What really happens is that the more laws you create, the easier it is for them to be gamed by big companies. And the classic example I give of this is, and traders and people who follow financial history will know it well, the Glass-Steagall Act was 35 pages. And that worked very well for over 7 decades. And it was essentially a principles-based law, meaning it established some very broad outlines of principles, and people had to stick to them. Dodd-Frank is 2,200 pages, and with thousands more pages being delegated to rule writing by committee. It's almost impossible for anyone to understand that. It's been called the Accountants and Lawyers Full-Time Employment Act. Since that's was passed almost a decade ago, we've seen less than 10 banks, new banks, started in the U.S. in a population of over 300 million people. One is essentially a principles-based approach, which works pretty well and is fairly easy and transparent to navigate. The other is almost impossible to navigate, essentially creates an insurmountable barrier to entry. The U.S. certainly does have smart and enlightened people. The problem is, one, regulating excessively creates barriers to entry. So the solution is not just go out and regulate more. That's the wrong solution. And then the second solution is essentially to realize that the revolving door itself means that if you create more agencies to be watchdogs over industries and companies, you're essentially creating a government-appointed ally that will then become a revolving door. So I think the argument I try to make in the book is that it's more nuanced than simply let's get more regulators and let's create more regulation. I use the analogy that regulation is like chemotherapy. The reason I use that is that chemotherapy is meant to kill off cancerous cells, and people who don't know very much about it think, well, as chemotherapy, the chemicals are just very smart and they go and attack the cancer and leave the body alone generally, and that's not really how it works. Chemotherapy kills healthy and unhealthy cancerous cells alike, except that most people have essentially stopped growing. And so the energy that we have is used for cell repair. So healthy cells are able to repair themselves, whereas cancerous cells are like startups. They grow very quickly. They dedicate all their energy to growth, not to cell repair. So when they get bombarded with chemicals, effectively, they then, when they try to replicate, their DNA is damaged, and that's when they die. If you think about regulation, the big companies have essentially stopped growing. They've got tons of energy dedicated to cell repair. So they've got lawyers, compliance officers, accountants. And small startups, their only energy is dedicated to grow. They don't have massive amounts of excess energy dedicated to cell repair. You can see that the most highly regulated industries are the ones that are generally the most concentrated, which is one reason why we see that in pharmaceuticals, medical care, insurance, and others.
I'm thinking of the states again right now, and I'm thinking of the last 2 presidents, Trump and Obama. Earlier in this conversation, you mentioned about increased M&A activity under Obama. And of course, I would think on the surface, most people, look, I mean, all these issues we're talking about go back a long period of time. So you can't necessarily say that some titular head in America, the president, is solely responsible. That's kind of like pie in the sky thinking. But I'm curious, has anything happened under Trump, the guy who is out there at rallies, talking among the people, talking like the people for the smaller guy? Is anything happened under Trump that gives you hope?
No, not really. There has been some rollback in regulation. I don't know or think that it's necessarily been well thought through or wise. But the big problem is that everyone talks a good game on the campaign trail. And then once they get in office, essentially the revolving door continues. It's pretty much gotten worse with every president, whether it's Republican or Democrat. And Trump has one of the highest levels of revolvers in terms of people who go from private practice to then head the agencies that will regulate the industry that they were just in. You'll recall that during the campaign trail in the final month, Trump had an ad where he was talking about sort of the international financial community, which is ruining the world, and he had a picture of Lloyd Blankfein and, clearly associating Goldman Sachs with ruining the world. Well, surprise, surprise, once he comes into power, he then names Gary Cohn. He had Steve Bannon, who's ex-Goldman, a partner. He had Scaramucci, who's an ex-vice president at Goldman, and many others at lower levels working from Goldman who went to the White House and to the executive branch. So the campaign trail, he might talk about rigged markets, and then as soon as he gets in, basically, it's the sort of same thing all over again. And Obama talked a good game too. But, you had a huge revolving door between the FCC and the FTC and then the companies that they were supposed to regulate. So I don't actually think that there is much difference between Republicans and Democrats in practice in terms of revolving doors.
It really does seem like to me that these issues that you've brought to bear in your work, in your book, are really accelerated in the last handful of years. I mean, it's so clear now. I mean, I don't know. I was in high school. I don't know what the verdict would have been in the early 80s. But I think with the advent of digital technology, it sure seems like in terms of, and of course, all these companies that are, for example, not digital, like airlines or funeral homes or whatnot, eventually they take on board digital technology that helps them to keep their moats as wide as possible. But it sure seems like to me, as we're having this conversation, as I've gone into your book, that things have accelerated in terms of the ability for a monopoly to protect itself from almost anything.
I don't know that it's the digital revolution that's creating the problem. I think that there are two reasons you might attribute this acceleration to. One is, I use the example, and I have the charts in the book. It looks sort of like the NCAA Sweet 16, where you get 16 players and then you're down to 8 players and then 4, and you get to the final winner. What we've seen over the last 40 years is that every decade's had a merger wave. And so you've just been knocking out competitors at every step. And the reason it looks like it's accelerating, obviously, is that we're now down to very few players in a lot of industries. So that's, I think, the reason why we're at the particular point in time that we are. Another reason is that the growth in regulation has been very high. The growth in patents has been very high. And all of these are cumulative in terms of the regulatory burden. It's like a ratchet, and it only moves in one direction. So I think it's that cumulative impact is what feels like the acceleration.
Let me take you to the patent and copyright issue. I know you've got some thoughts on that as well. Of course, as somebody who has authored books like yourself, I'm concerned about the word copyright as well. But speak to that issue. There's obviously limits and whatnot, but ultimately there's been no limit, for example, and I'm not sure how they are protected exactly, how their IP is protected. But for example, something like Coca-Cola, right? I mean, their IP is serious business. I mean, that is protected like crazy. I don't know if any government authorities have access to it exactly, but I'm sure even if it got out, they would bring the full force of a god upon anybody that tried to act on that information. So speak to me about your views on patents and copyrights, because look, as creators, you say to yourself, you want to be greedy to some degree as a creator. You say, gosh, if I write a book or I invent a soft drink or I make a painting or something, I don't want it to be swiped from me for some arbitrary number of years has passed.
Yeah, so there's a section in the book which talks about patents, and it's the same chapter as regulation. And what's interesting is that if you're looking at patents and copyrights, they very much act as a monopoly, and they're a good thing. So if you look at countries or historical cities that were very wealthy and powerful that tended to be the ones that respected copyrights and patents and had decent rule of law. So Venice, at the height of its riches, was the first to introduce patents effectively. And it was meant to reward ingenuity, to reward creators. That's a good thing. The problem emerges when the patent system is abused. So, for example, England was very far behind the continent. They created letters of patent to induce Italians and continentals to move to England and bring scientific know-how and engineering know-how there. Over time, though, the monarch was granting patents for everything from like salt to playing cards and things that patents were never meant to be applied to. So there was a Patent Reform Act in the UK in the 1620s that was meant to end these sort of patent abuses. So you have on the one hand, sort of the patents are clearly necessary for spurring innovation. And then at the other hand, they can be abused if they're extended too widely or for very long periods of time. Where we find ourselves in the United States today is that it really was in the early 1980s that you had the beginning of an explosion in patents. And then what we've seen is an increasing extension in copyright. Previously, works that were written would enjoy a period where the creator could benefit from that. But then these time periods have been extended and extended further. So believe it or not, Disney, almost all of their big hits come from stories that are essentially in the public domain, like Cinderella and others, stories by Hans Christian Andersen. So they've profited widely from being able to retell these stories, yet their own Mickey Mouse, essentially, they've been extending U.S. copyright to absurd limits that were never envisaged in the Constitution. And then on the drug side, for example, in terms of patents, that gives you an effective monopoly over a drug. What happens is that these drugs then get reformulated when the patent's about to expire to then further extend them, which means that you can't get generics introduced to create some competition and low prices. Because the FDA is relatively slow, doesn't have enough resources, a variety of reasons, you don't end up with the approval of any generics, and the reformulations, which are not new or novel in any way, further extend the copyright. I think it's a nuanced argument. Like, you and I should benefit from having some copyright on the books that we write, but that shouldn't be in perpetuity. Eventually, those books should enter the public domain in the same way that we can now. Furthermore, patents for medicines shouldn't be extended indefinitely.
You are really doing a nice job by putting all these issues out there because, let's face it, the public debate about whatever the public is debating on any particular week is usually about something that is generally the types of debate that Jack Nicholson might have had with the cast of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But you are putting out there legitimate topics that I would have a sneaky suspicion that even if, and maybe you have done this, even if you were sitting down with the Google guys or Mark Zuckerberg or Warren Buffett, they're very smart guys. They seem honorable. I don't see how they could sit at a table with you and say, you know what, Jonathan, you're just crazy. These issues are immaterial. I would have a sneaky suspicion that they would say, yes, these are legitimate things for society to be thinking about. And perhaps some of our success is directly as a result of these protections that maybe we shouldn't have.
One, this is not a left or right issue. I think that this is an issue that broadly concerns everyone. People might come at it from, let's say a more free markets approach where they want more competition. They might come at it from a more left-leaning egalitarian approach where they want to see higher wages and have companies bid for workers and avoid the monopsony problem. So there are a variety of reasons that we can all then converge on in a set of solutions. And I think that if you speak to a lot of people in Silicon Valley, and I've done this, you get a very different reaction off the record than you might get on the record, right? I suspect that Mark Zuckerberg was not thinking when he set up Facebook in his dorm at Harvard that he was then going to become the arbiter of free speech and what is good and appropriate or not. These companies have essentially now become private governments where they determine who has a right to be heard or not on their platform. Do they really want to be making these decisions? I suspect that Facebook probably doesn't. But they've now essentially become the determiners of who can speak and who can't. I do think that they would like to see more regulation in a way that takes some of these choices out of their hands so that they're not essentially functioning in private capacity as a regulator themselves.
I've left with kind of one inescapable thought as I meander through your world and through your mind and what you've put together, and that's the notion of evolution. Are we facing a situation, and I think we probably are, where, my nephews and niece that are teenagers today, are they going to be talking about the same companies 30 years from now? Is that going to be the big dark guy in the corner? It's going to be these same 5, 6, 7 digital companies are going to dominate their life for the next 30 years? I don't know. I can't imagine how that won't be true based on the way you're kind of making these arguments. What's going to knock off a Google? What's going to knock off Facebook? What's going to knock off the mindset that Buffett has brought? And again, as you know from the beginning of this conversation, I can't necessarily say their motivations are wrong, because I tend to think that if I was in their position, I would have done the same damn thing.
That, I think, is the way the world works. If you look at Cornelius Vanderbilt, who is the first real robber baron and monopolist, the reason that he was able to really start out in business was that he won a case against a monopolist. He was a captain, his nickname was Commodore, but over time, essentially, he then turned himself into a monopolist. And you see this in industry after industry, where industries often start out as being small and dispersed, and then they centralize. And then Tim Wu, in his book, The Master Switch, I think it's one of the best books I've read on media and technology, maps this out, whether it was in telephones with AT&T becoming the monopolist, whether it was RCA in radio, or then cable companies. And so what you find is that over time, one company then, the urge is obviously for profit, which is good, but they then want to achieve that any way they can. And often it's through the legal system, through laws, through regulation, and it ends up stifling creativity and productivity. And so getting back to your point about evolution, I completely agree. One of the central elements of evolution is essentially competition. It's the struggle for survival. It's making sure that the sort of best traits get passed on and new traits get introduced. We've seen the startup rates in the US collapse, and in many other countries too, where there's less competition. And I think that that's a very bad thing if we're not getting new startups entering and competing. And that's one of the key themes in the book. And I have loads and loads of charts there, but we do need more competition, and we do need startups, and we don't want companies to get old and fat and merely survive because they have more power through crony capitalism.
I would have thought back in the 1990s that company like Blockbuster, before we could imagine digital movies and all that stuff, none of us could have, including Blockbuster, imagined the Netflix. And then, of course, Blockbuster became a dinosaur. I look at something like Apple. Apple had such tremendous ups and downs. And you mentioned Bill Gates and the search bar. Gosh, if it wasn't but for perhaps some investment from Microsoft related to the court case, that Apple never would have survived to become as big as they've become. It is such an interesting discussion that you've put on the table, because I generally don't think that the Google guys, for example, as they sat down to start their business, were thinking kind of dastardly things. I think they were the 5th or 6th or 7th or 10th entrant in the search market. They make a bundle of money, they start buying things. Again, I would have done the same thing. I'm almost positive. But on the flip side, now that we're at that point where we can see these monopolies and we can see what's happening across society, we can see the lack of competition, we can see the lack of evolution, I think you're raising points that everyone, regardless of left or right, has to think about, has to debate, has to discuss. If we don't, I think it's pretty clear, and you make the case, what's going to happen. We can see the future.
Absolutely. I hope that the book is able to, one, help illuminate the problem. I mean, I try to make it as an entertaining a read as possible. So everyone who's read the book has told me that they've absolutely loved it and generally read it cover to cover in one go. So I hope that by writing a book that's accessible, it helps raise these issues so that we can then start to look for solutions. I humbly set out some solutions in the last chapter, but there might be others, and certainly it's one that we need to have. And I think that the public discussion and debates take time. I have a chapter in there on history. You can see that the introduction of the original Sherman Act and Clayton Act, and even the enforcement of it took time. And so I think that we have to start now having these discussions, because it's not going to happen overnight from someone listening to this podcast or reading the book. It's going to take more people. It's going to take a open discussion to be able to have some positive change.
The book, The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies and the Death of Competition. Jonathan, I appreciate you coming on today. Is there a website we can send people to?
Absolutely. So mythofcapitalism.com. The introduction and the first chapter are there online. You can read both of them. There's a tab on endorsements, and I've been humbled and touched by the endorsement of people like Kenneth Rogoff, 2 Nobel Prize winners, Sir Angus Deaton, Michael Spence, and historian Neil Ferguson. So all these are heroes of mine, and I really do hope that the readers enjoy the book.
No doubt about that. You definitely have. As a fellow author, I look at your book blurbs and I'm like, okay, he's got the highest level that you could possibly get of people endorsing your books. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.